And that was pretty much the end of the story as far as ECW as a wrestling promotion, as its own standalone wrestling promotion. And the reason why I'm saying that is because in the few years after that, there had been a bunch of reunion shows, and WWE even revived it as another program for their show. That's a whole story in and of itself that we're not going to get into right now. Well, now we're going to talk about it, at least a little bit. Hi everybody, and welcome to episode 34 of Life Lessons and Combat Sports. I'm your host, Eric Hamidi. Thank you for joining me for another episode. So, a little bit of background on this particular episode is that I really wanted to get an episode out for the 20-year anniversary of the revival of ECW, but what I kind of realized, and this is a little bit of my own doing, is that I didn't really set the stage all that much, and I felt like I couldn't tell the story about that without giving you the context of things that happened the year prior before talking about this. So my approach for this particular episode is to basically do kind of an overall cumulative overview of the ECW revival, and then somewhere down the line, I'll make separate episodes talking about these matters on their own. So basically, in the future, I'll make a separate episode talking about WWE's endeavors with ECW in 2005, and then somewhere down the road, I'll make one for 2006, and just basically any kind of information that I don't get to say in this episode, I will do it at a later time. So what I'll recommend you do before you continue watching this one is to watch episode 22 and episode 28, because in those episodes I talk about the history of ECW and I go into detail as far as everything that happened with the company. So I'm not going to do that here, but just as a general overview of what ECW was, it was a wrestling promotion that started in 1992 as Eastern Championship Wrestling, but then became Extreme Championship Wrestling in 1994. And basically, even though they had limited resources, funding, or distribution compared to WWF and WCW, they were able to make a stake in the world of wrestling in the 90s in the United States. And just like, even though they were in the land of the giants, they were able to make their mark in some way, and just they had this devoted fan following with their innovative programming, innovative style, unique wrestlers you wouldn't see anywhere else, and all that stuff. So there was a passionate fan following for ECW, but just they had a lot of financial problems that just kept mounting. And the easiest way that I can put it is that if it costs $700,000 to put on a show, ECW was spending $900,000, and they just kept doing that over and over and over again up until the point where their financial problems reached a boiling point, and then they basically had to file for bankruptcy in April of 2001. So this is kind of a continuation of my whole goal with this podcast for 2026, to make episodes about ECW, considering that this is the 25-year anniversary of ECW's bankruptcy. So I talk about all that stuff in episode 22, and then in episode 19, I give a little bit of an overview as far as what happened to ECW immediately afterwards when they filed for bankruptcy. And basically what happened was that WWE and the video game company Acclaim, they each had an argument to make as far as who would get the assets of ECW. So this included the trademarks, the video library, which was probably the most valuable thing about it, and logos and all this other stuff. So in 2003, basically Acclaim got a certain amount of money as part of a settlement, and then all that intellectual property for ECW was now owned by WWE. So by the end of 2003, you had a situation where 2 out of the 3 major wrestling promotions in the 90s were now owned by WWE, who was the other major wrestling promotion in the 90s and the survivor of all that. So with all that stuff, they really put that video to use. Like all the stuff that they had from WCW and ECW, they started making really good use of that, or just, at least they used it to make DVDs, documentaries, match compilations, and all this other stuff. So they had been doing that a little bit with WCW, and then finally in 2004 was, if I'm not mistaken, the first extensive use of the video library for ECW to create a documentary called The Rise and Fall of ECW. This was a documentary that came out in November of 2004, and it's basically a 3-hour documentary that talked about nearly the entire history of the company. And the only reason I'm saying that is because for some reason they mainly start in the fall of 1993 when Paul Heyman joined the company as part of creative and all that stuff. And if y'all remember, Paul Heyman, he eventually became the owner of ECW. So for some reason the documentary starts there. I don't really know why, but regardless about that, they talk about the company history from the beginning up until the very end. And it was a DVD that sold really well. I mean, there was a period of time where that was WWE's second best-selling DVD ever, and just, in general, it's one of their best-selling documentaries that they've ever done. So, I mean, like, just from a personal perspective, that was a documentary that I was really interested in, and I was really interested to look at the company history of ECW. And what I will say is that was the first real extensive look that I had into the company, where I actually got to understand their ethos, what they were about, and what was their style. Because up until then, I'd only seen a very select few matches from ECW, and I didn't realize that kind of violent, hardcore style was the norm for that company, because the matches that I would see from ECW prior to this documentary, it was involving either wrestlers who weren't really known for their weapon usage, or they didn't use them during their matches, or if there were weapons involved or what have you, and they were hardcore matches, they involved Mick Foley, also known as Mankind in WWF, and it's like, oh, well, of course there would be weapons involved in his match, or just like, oh, they made it a hardcore match because it involved him or whatever. So I didn't realize that kind of loose rule set was really a part of ECW's style. But regardless, I was just fascinated to learn more about ECW, and just like I really got a sense of all the things that happened with the company and all that stuff. So, aside from all that, that was something that I really enjoyed. And that was a documentary that I remember I watched over and over and over again, just because I was so fascinated by it. It really is one of WWE's best productions. So, like I've been alluding to, the DVD sales were really good for that. And then the wheels were in motion to do an ECW reunion pay-per-view. So from my understanding, what happened was that Rob Van Dam, who was a former wrestler for ECW and working for WWE, he suggested to the higher-ups that they should do an ECW reunion show. So all the sales from the DVD combined with that suggestion, WWE basically set up a show for the Hammerstein Ballroom in New York City on June 12th, 2005, and it was going to be called ECW One Night Stand. That is a historical show, and honestly, that's looked back upon as a very well-produced show and all that stuff. I mean, it's just, when you think of top pay-per-views, I mean, ECW One Night Stand really is up there. And just, to me, with the kind of like general idea of this particular episode, I feel like that was an instance where they did an ECW show or a revival or relaunch well, which I find kind of fascinating, because when I was researching for this episode, what I discovered is that originally they were not going to have Paul Heyman involved with the production of the show, which to me is crazy, because you literally have the creative genius of ECW and the guy who would eventually become the owner of the company, and you're not going to have him involved in the writing and the production of the show? Oh, I don't know. When I found out about that, I was like, what the hell? And I don't know. To be honest, I feel like that would have been a disaster. That would have led to a lot of problems if that initial One Night Stand pay-per-view wasn't, written or produced by Paul Heyman. I mean, thank God, Logic won, and they actually did involve him in the process of all that. Basically, from what I found out was that Paul, he even wrote 3 different scripts for ECW One Night Stand. I guess that just shows you the creative prowess that Paul Heyman had, or just the versatility that he had in order to basically have backup plans where, okay, if the WWE brass didn't like one of his ideas, then he had other ideas in mind. So he was heavily involved in the creation of that show, and Tommy Dreamer, who also wrestled for ECW, also played a role in the production of that show. So you have 2 individuals who are a key part of ECW, who were part of the company and were there for a long time and understood what it was about putting on this show. And I think that was very critical, because if you didn't, then things would have been, I don't think things would have been as good. But that was one of the things that was a key, I guess, that was something that was very important with One Night Stand that Paul Heyman wanted to accomplish, was that he wanted it to be an authentic presentation of ECW, or at least as authentic of a presentation as you can in 2005, being produced by a major company like WWE. So, another little bit of a side note as far as being authentic, or just like having as accurate of a presentation of ECW as you can. It's crazy that originally the only people who were going to be part of One Night Stand were going to be currently contracted WWE wrestlers who had been in ECW, which that's another example of me thinking that had they gone that route, then the show wouldn't have been as successful, because you would have been kind of limited, and you would have been limited in the amount of people who would have been part of the event, and you would have not had as many people who were core or key figures of ECW like Sabu or Sandman were. Like if you just had guys like Eddie Guerrero or Rey Mysterio who were in the company at the time performing for One Night Stand, it's like, well, they were only part of the company for such a short period of time. They weren't, people who made their names and became synonymous with the organization. So that was another kind of initial plan that eventually logic prevailed, and they, opened it up to like other individuals who weren't working for WWE at the time. So One Night Stand goes off, and the show did really well. It got over 300,000 pay-per-view buys, and like I said, it has a high rating among fans. And I will say this, just because I do need to move on to other topics. There is a key takeaway that I do have from One Night Stand 2005 that I'll say for another time, because that could be its own kind of episode. But that show was really good, and I think that event has an important life lesson. A little bit of a teaser for a later time when I do an episode solely on One Night Stand 2005. So the year goes on, and then at the end of 2005 and early 2006, there's an idea from Shane McMahon, who is Vince McMahon's son, to do an online-only program. And that online program was going to be ECW. They decided, okay, ECW was really hot. We're able to make a lot of money on this. There's still some interest. So we're going to go ahead and make this online-only show ECW. And I guess it kind of made sense for them to do that, but even from the very beginning, like even having the idea, you kind of ran into some problems, or just like there were some initial problems that were very evident, because from what I've gathered from various documentaries or books that I'm reading about the ECW revival in 2006, it's that you couldn't just bring back the original ECW. So what I mean by that is that if they just took ECW as it was when it ended in 2001 and just started it again in 2006, then that wouldn't have been successful. Or just bringing back all the wrestlers who were part of that company, that wasn't going to work. Just, I think there were a lot of factors that played a role in that, just given the fact that people's interests or what was considered innovative by 2006 wasn't the same as the 90s and the early 2000s. And then you also had a situation where some of the wrestlers, they just weren't at the same level they were a decade earlier. And just, I don't know, it would have just been trying to like recreate lightning in a bottle, which is something that you can't really do. And I feel like that's something that was a problem with all these ECW relaunches that happened, both with WWE and also from the independent circuit, because there were some independent shows that did reunion shows themselves. But at the same time, you had to have people who were part of ECW as part of this project, because if this is something that you're calling ECW and it's just filled with entirely new wrestlers who had never been there, then you run into the problem of, okay, well, this isn't, matching the name. This isn't matching our expectations. This isn't ECW. So how can you call it that? So that was a conundrum that was evident. So I guess the thing that was sort of decided upon was that you were going to have some of the old guys from ECW, and then you were going to have some new up-and-comers part of this show to basically create a well-rounded program. And, to be honest, I feel like that could have worked, just given what we saw, several years later when WWE started NXT, and also based on what I've heard some people's booking ideas. It's something that could have worked. You could have had a mixture of the former ECW wrestlers who were part of the original, and then you have new guys that you develop. So I guess it kind of would have, that was actually one of the goals for it, was that it was going to be WWE's developmental. It was just kind of like a tricky thing to try to navigate, and just, I think, honestly, things about One Night Stand 2005, the takeaways that you have from it, kind of shows why doing a relaunch of ECW wasn't gonna work. So originally it was going to be an online show, but then there was some interest from networks, or just, I guess I'll say this, either the higher-ups in WWE sent out feelers to different television networks to see if they would carry it, or the networks, some television networks themselves, expressed interest in paying a rights fee to air that program. So what ended up happening was that instead of being just online, then it started airing on Sci-Fi. And you may be thinking, Sci-Fi Channel, why is a wrestling program going to be on there? Well, Sci-Fi was owned by NBC Universal, which also owned the USA Network, which had been airing WWE Raw for many years at that point. So that's how they kind of landed on there. And from what I gathered, once it went from, oh, we're going to air this show online, to we're going to air it on TV, then Vince McMahon, who owned WWE, took control of the show. And based on this documentary that I saw, due to certain masters that Vince McMahon had to serve with their networks, or just what they expected from WWE programming, it had to stop being like the original ECW. And also, once it went to Sci-Fi, it took things out of Shane's hands and then put it into Vince McMahon's hands. And that caused a lot of problems. Just, like I said, there were certain expectations that their partners had for programming, but also they were going to have more restrictions and more censorship than they would if they were online. That was one of the things that I saw, was that if they, they wanted to keep the show online, So then that way they could be a little grittier and, not have to deal with all that stuff. But, that's how everything kind of played out. And then ECW One Night Stand 2006 was going to serve as the relaunch of it, or just, as opposed to the year prior where it was just its own standalone pay-per-view, this time it was going to lead into the television show. And you could tell from One Night Stand 2006 how it was different from 2005, just given the fact that the way that they shot the show, or just even the way the ring looked, and the type of commentary that the announcers were doing and all that stuff, it was all different from One Night Stand 2005. And just not even just that, but they also had a bunch of guys who were wrestling matches on the show who weren't even part of the original ECW. So you had guys like John Cena, Randy Orton, Kurt Angle on there. So they had more of a WWE touch to everything. So from what I've gathered, it was kind of one of those things where One Night Stand 2006 is still considered a good show, but it's not as good as One Night Stand 2005. So One Night Stand 2006 happens, and then we go into the premiere episode of ECW on Sci-Fi on June 13th, 2006. This was 2 days after the One Night Stand 2006 show. And today marks the 20-year anniversary of that show's premiere, which I wanted to make an episode about to commemorate that. And I will say that whatever differences that you saw on One Night Stand 2006, you saw even more so on the program. Or just, it was kind of one of those things where it just it was like, kind of like really ingrained how different this was going to be. And I guess I'm saying that because for me, going back into the mindset that I had at the time watching it, even I noticed the differences with it. And this is coming from somebody who was hoping it could be successful, or wanted it to be successful, or wanted to have some kind of a dose of ECW that I could watch, given that I didn't watch the original company. It's like one of those things where I wanted it to work and I wanted it to be good, but even I noted the differences between what I saw on that premiere episode on Sci-Fi and what I had seen from One Night Stand 2005 or the old ECW matches. Because one of the things that they wanted to do with the web-only show version was that they were going to have a little bit of a lower budget and have a little bit of a grittier look and do it in smaller venues. But here you had them doing a show in an arena that WWE would typically do. It was well lit, and just everything about it just looked the same from Raw or SmackDown in a sense, as far as, okay, here's where the announce table is. This is what it looks like. Here's the ring. This is what it looks like, and all this other stuff. It really kind of seemed like the only differences were a slightly different hard camera angle and some different logos. And that was pretty much it. It didn't look or feel, it didn't even look or feel different from WWE shows, let alone looking like the old ECW events. And, that, like I said, that's just due to all the different masters they had to serve. And just as the months went on, all these problems just got worse and worse. Just, you have people who are getting involved in creative, or just like, everything has to be approved by Vince McMahon. And it's kind of one of those things where he may have had some creative shortcomings, or just didn't really understand how to present ECW in a cool way, or just in its own way, or just like in a way that fans would actually enjoy it. So what you ended up with was kind of like a watered down version of WWE, because you have the same kind of look that it would have to WWE's main shows, and then you had guys who were on WWE's main roster, Raw and SmackDown, competing on ECW. So you couldn't create its like own identity. And it's, all that stuff just makes you think like, okay, If this is just a watered down version of WWE and it's a lesser than version of it, then why am I going to watch it? One thing of note that's very interesting about that ECW on Sci-Fi episode, I mean, this is probably the most infamous thing, is the fact that they had a zombie on there. And that was just basically to appease the network and viewers of the channel who may have been tuning in. So they just throw a zombie in there, and it's like he was part of the first official match of ECW on Sci-Fi, which even right there, you could tell how different this was going to be, and it was going to be nothing like the original, because it's like this is something that the original ECW would have never put on. And yet here we were with it. So another example of how it was similar to WWE. So this was a project, this whole WWECW, as people like to call it. This was a project that lasted, several years. But to be honest, even from the very get-go, you could see how this may not work or how there were problems. And just as more time went on, people got more frustrated creatively. Paul Heyman got into a lot of arguments with Vince McMahon about all the different ideas for the show and things he wanted to do. Wrestlers were demoralized. People got removed from it, and just they started pushing WWE homegrown talent, or just like, WWE pet projects, or people who came up through that system, like pushing people like that as opposed to a Sabu or Sandman or what have you. And it just didn't work. It's the ECW revival is not looked upon very fondly, and just there are reasons why. And with regards to the entire history of that relaunch, I can go into more detail later, but that was, it's interesting about WWE's ECW projects in 2005 and 2006, in the sense that they all have a common theme, which is why I wanted to make this episode. I think what those two actions show us is that whatever you do in your life, execution is key. Now, there's different phrases you can use as far as, you have to execute something well, or you have to know how not to do something, or you have to have a good start to something. But to me, when you look at One Night Stand 2005 or 2006, and then the ECW on Sci-Fi show, what those show us is that here are the good examples, and then here are the bad examples of execution. Here's an example of when it was done well. Here's one when it wasn't done well. Here's one that was very meticulous and detailed and knew what they were doing or knew how to make it authentic. And then here's how they muddied the waters and got confused and lost sight of what made ECW ECW. I mean, there's plenty of ways that executing something well can play out in your own life. I mean, if I want to combine something from the entertainment or production world, I mean, if it's like the simple idea of if you're trying to produce a film, you can have a really good script for a film, or you can have a really good idea for it even. But if the story is poorly made, poorly produced, then it's not going to be a good production. It's just one of those things where, as you're going about making it, you have to you have to be very careful and very, detailed, or just like you have to know what you're doing. I mean, here's a weird kind of like analogy I've kind of thought. I'm sure there's some multiverse out there, or maybe there's another universe where Jurassic Park is one of the worst movies that you've ever seen. And in that same universe, like, I don't know, Master of Disguise is a cinematic masterpiece. It's just like, there's a lot of work that goes into making those, or just there's a lot of work missing that didn't make those into good movies. So that is an example how things need to be executed well. But I mean, just even if that's not the line of work that you're in, just things in your everyday life have to have a good execution. So that can play out in, okay, well, you're starting a new job and you have to make sure you get off to a good start, or just like in order to perform well at this new place and make a good impression, then you have to make sure that you're on top of your game. Or I mean, this can even play out in this way, just like if you're starting a new relationship, then, you know, y'all have to make sure that you guys get off to a good start, or you just make sure that y'all are on the same page, and that's, you know, done through communication and all that stuff. I think that is another example of how execution is key. And just, I think about it, I guess, like when I think about my own experiences as far as execution, I guess I think about it in some, I guess I think about instances where maybe I didn't do as good of a job of executing something well. It just, you know, starting out at a new job and just kind of like, you know, maybe not being on my A game as much as I should have been. And just, you know, there's various circumstances about that. And just, I think that's a good segue into the whole idea that, like, you know, you can have a plan for something and things can change course. You know, that's life. But you have to at least have a good idea and a good plan in mind. And just maybe in those kinds of instances, I didn't do as good of a job as, you know, making sure that I was able to succeed in those roles. And just all you can really do from those instances is just kind of learn from that and then move forward. So that's kind of like the takeaway that I have from all of that. I mean, to be honest, that might be a good value for this particular episode, is kind of looking at, I guess, the relaunch of ECW and seeing how the execution wasn't done well, and just how, and I guess I'm just saying that because I'm noting things that I could have done better, and just there were definitely a lot of things that the relaunch could have done better themselves. But regardless, you know, there's a lot of different ways you can implement this in your own life. These are just a few ways that these are just a few examples that I've described, but I mean, just there's multiple different ways. And just like, I think having that understanding that something has to be executed well, what I'm kind of hoping for you as a viewer, and just kind of maybe this is a little bit of a word for myself, because this is something that I kind of realize, is that I think to have that consciously in your mind can help set you up better for success, or just to really have that in your mind, that will prevent you from slipping up. And just like, I don't know, maybe if you have that awareness and that you're very, you know, not even just in the back of your mind, if you do have it in the front of your mind, hey, we gotta perform well and we gotta get off to a good start, or just we have to, you know, execute the plan very well, then that can make you perform even better. So for now, that's the life lesson for a collective look on WWE's ECW projects, and then somewhere down the line we'll dissect those individual projects in more detail and assign a life lesson with them. I just wanted to get this out there and just take a little bit of a trip down memory lane for right now, and I hope that you enjoyed this episode. Let me know what you think about it in the comments section below. Let me know if you have any memories of either the original ECW One Night Stand 2005, or the relaunch in 2006. Be sure to like, share, subscribe to my videos, and be sure to follow me on my social media accounts. I'm Life and Combat Sports on Instagram, and I'm L Combat Sports on Twitter. I'll catch y'all on the next one. See ya.